Welcome back, everyone. I hope you've been enjoying the summit so far. And if you're just joining us, I'm Mark Duggan, the Trione Director of CEPR, and I'm so glad that you're with us today. I don't think anyone is going to argue with the premise that one of the biggest challenges to come from the pandemic over these past 2 years is how and where we work. The notion of working from home went from a novel concept to one of necessity, literally overnight. And now businesses are thinking through how or whether to bring workers back into the office. This is having a gigantic impact on labor markets, urban centers, wages, and where people are choosing to live. Our three panelists, are truly some of the best experts to discuss these issues. Nicholas Bloom is a CEPR Senior Fellow and the William Eberly Professor of Economics at Stanford. He's also the co-director of the Productivity, Innovation, and Entrepreneurship program at the National Bureau of Economic Research and has studied and written extensively about the impact of working from home. He's also an expert on management practices and measuring uncertainty. Hayden Brown is the CEO of Upwork, which helps connect businesses with independent talent and personnel from around the world. Through various roles at Upwork over the past decade, Hayden has helped the company grow from 75 employees and $100 million in gross services volume to more than 2,000 independent professionals and full-time employees and more than $2.5 billion in gross services volume. Before joining Upwork, Hayden held corporate development positions at Microsoft and LivePerson and began her career as an analyst at McKinsey & Company. Karen Kimbrough is the chief economist for LinkedIn Corporation and has been with the company for 2 years. Before that, she was the assistant treasurer for Google and also worked as managing director and head of macroeconomic policy at Bank of America Merrill Lynch. Karen has worked at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York and was an economist and FX strategist at Morgan Stanley. She currently serves on the board of Fannie Mae, is an advisor to 3x5 Partners, and serves on the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago's Academic Advisory Council and the Economic Advisory Panel of the New York Fed. After we hear from, I believe the order is Hayden, then Karen, then Nick, but they're going to correct me. I'm going to moderate a Q&A, and then we'll turn things over for audience questions. So I encourage all of you who are watching, to the extent that you have questions, feel free to send them in now or anytime over the next 30 or 40 minutes. So with that, I am delighted to hand the baton to Hayden.
Mark, thank you so much. And Nick, Stanford, CEPR, thank you for having me. Karen, it's great to serve with you as a fellow panelist. Upwork is the world's work marketplace, and we enable companies and talent to work together in new ways to really unlock their potential. With our mission, which is to create economic opportunities so people have better lives, Upwork continues to transform how the world works. And certainly that's a topic that we are excited to dive into today. We serve companies that range from one-person startups to 30% of the Fortune 100, and our talent community earns over $3.3 billion on Upwork in 2021 across over 10,000 skill categories. So it's a very diverse and exciting talent community that is flourishing, working remotely on our platform, and we see kind of on a front row basis what's happening in the world of work. I think there are some slides, and I think if you could pull those up, I want to talk a little bit about some of the trends that we're seeing right now in the world of work. Going to the second slide around what we call the trend right now of the work awakening. We see a massive awakening of employees and professionals broadly in the work landscape right now, as we're experiencing this tectonic shift in how work gets done. And I think this is actually accelerating, not slowing down. Things like freelancing is just a part of it. Things like, thank you very much for the slides, remote teams, hybrid teams, which include freelancers and employees working together side by side inside of corporations. All of these things are happening as employees and professionals generally have come through 2 years of experimentation in their personal and professional lives, working from home during the pandemic. And those experiences were not, they felt very individualized, people kind of figuring out and breaking old habits, starting new ones, setting up work from home setups in their homes. Those individualized experiences, however, were really part of a collective experience. And that aha moment happening across society and across professionals, waking up to the fact that the old work models were no longer serving them. And I want to quickly touch on a few of the trends, if you can advance the next slide, that are really driving this awakening. So first of all, people realize that working models that were serving them in the past are no longer serving them in the current day. And you see this with everything from risk-taking for workers, the paradigm there changing fundamentally as people say, wait a minute, I'm willing to take risks in my career that are profoundly different from the risks I was willing to take pre-pandemic. Also seeing the calculus of jobs and careers that actually felt risky in the past, actually feeling safe and different today. And we see that with things like the acceleration of freelancing and people feeling safer, controlling their career as an entrepreneur, as a freelancer, and feeling like that is actually a safer path than being at the behest for perhaps of a larger corporation. If you advance to the next slide, thank you so much. We're also seeing so many of these trends around, starting small businesses, and people choosing just these different career paths, again, as they're seeing a different value proposition in their careers and in their work generally than as they saw pre-2020. We see this also across all generations of workers. It's not concentrated with just a singular worker type or generation. And I think this is something that is widespread. We see this across many data types. I'm sure some of the other panelists here will speak to that. Advancing to the next slide, the second big trend here is around how employers are responding to this. So the first trend is workers waking up to new value propositions, new ways that they want to work. And the second one is employers responding and saying, we need to work with workers in a different way, seeing that they have different demands, different desires, and different needs than what they had in the past or what we were willing to attend to in the past. And so if you could advance the slide, businesses are now experimenting with new work types. They started this experimentation certainly during the pandemic, and they adopted new tools, new technologies, new ways of working, started thinking about their cultures very differently. But this experimentation is really just the beginning, because they're seeing that with these new demands of workers and the new advances that these tools and technologies give them in terms of things like agility, access to diverse talent, cost savings, efficiencies, all of this is actually a win-win for businesses and for talent if they're willing to really construct new ways of working that look different than they did in the past. And so this leads us to really the third trend that we're seeing coming out of this, if you could advance the slide, which is around these experimentations leading to not just differences in the composition of the workforce or differences in ways of working that might look marginally different from the past, but actually much more fundamental shifts in the ways that work itself are getting done and the ways that the work will look moving forward. And if you look at this tweet from Steven Sinofsky shown here on the right, it really speaks to the fact that we are seeing the beginning of fundamental changes to work. We're not at the end of that. And I think many people coming out of the pandemic might think, now we get to go back to normal. Now we get to see things settle down. But I would argue we're actually at the beginning of the tectonic changes that are ahead of us rather than at the end of those, because as people integrate remote work, different working models, different tools, we are actually starting to pull at the threads of how we change things like the 9-to-5 workday, the 5-day work week, the ways that work actually get done operationally on the ground inside of companies that adopt things like remote work at scale in their businesses, fundamentally change the construct of how the corporation operates, how work looks like. And I think that is going to mean that the next 5 to 10 years of work fundamentally actually overhaul in many corporations, many of the core work practices and what that looks like. So more changes ahead, not less. Finally, going to the last slide here, the way that we work at Upwork has actually always been pretty radically different than I think the way most companies work. We consider ourselves to be pioneers on many of these dimensions. We've always had a heavily remote work model. During the pandemic, we just committed to that full stop. 2/3 of our team is independent freelance talent. So that's a kind of very, I think, cutting edge way that we operate ourselves. 80 countries around the world is like a very distributed model, again, in terms of how we operate. I think many more companies will look like that going forward than they have historically looked in the past. And for us, this has been the way we've operated for 15 to 20 years. We don't even consider it possible to go back to a different way of working. We continue to push our model forward. And I think many more companies founded on remote work, highly distributed teams. Again, we see ourselves operating radically different than many peers out there. And I think as we talk to other companies that are founded on remote first or highly distributed team principles, they also end up operating and looking very differently. And I think that's where we'll start to see more and more companies that look and operate and feel very different than companies that do not operate this way. And it'll be fascinating to see how this world of work continues to evolve as companies take advantage of many of the benefits and advantages that these ways of work offer. So excited to dive in on this conversation.
Thanks. Thanks so much for those remarks, Hayden. And I think next up is Karen. So Karen, take it away.
All right. Well, thank you so much. Thanks, Mark, for having me, and Nick also, and Hayden. It's also great to share this moment and event with you at CPER. So I'm the Chief Economist at LinkedIn, and I want to share with you a little bit about what LinkedIn is seeing in our data. And just to recap, hopefully it's helpful, as LinkedIn is this platform or marketplace of 800 million members worldwide. And we have some 50 million plus companies also on our platform, and tens of thousands of schools as well. And so it's an opportunity to really see the career paths of individuals, see the demand and supply side of the labor market, between what employers are looking for and what potential candidates are offering in terms of their skills and experience. And on our platform, we have 3 new members every second, and 6 hires happen every minute. So in the time that I've been talking, there have been 6 new hires. So it's pretty exciting set of data to look through. And before I show my slides, maybe I'll just give you a quick perspective on what we think 2022 is going to kind of show for us in terms of the world of work. So first off, we're seeing employers really looking for ways to operate in a post-pandemic mode because the labor market is really tight, especially for, I would say, advanced digital or technological skills. It's really put employees in the driver's seat. And so that means that companies are looking for ways to retain talent as opposed to just having to always hire. And that is also emphasizing a lot around internal mobility, the opportunities to kind of find your next job in the company that you're already in, as opposed to having to leave. We can see also a real focus on reconnection. So if finally things are starting to open up, especially here in California where I am, we can finally kind of walk around without the mask. It is an opportunity for people to think, do I want to go back to the office? And if I am going back, why am I going back? I'm going back to reconnect, to energize, to collaborate. So the use of the office is going to, of course, be fundamentally changed, I think, going forward. Maybe it's a good time now for me to kind of hop into my slides if you're able to show them. Yeah, so great. So I would say on the left-hand side, you'll see the stat of 37%. What we're seeing since last year is a pretty significant increase in the share of members on our platform who are changing jobs. So they are quitting and finding a new role. And so there was a 37% increase in members last year in 2021 who are doing this. It's possible to say, oh, well, that's just an increase relative to 2020 when things were subdued. And it's true that in 2020, things were quite subdued. But this is also quite a big increase relative to 2019. So there's something here. People are changing jobs at an increased rate. And that's, of course, putting more pressure on employers to try to think about how do they retain, especially key employees. It is indeed a workers' economy. We are seeing workers be far choosier about looking for jobs. They're obviously negotiating more heavily for salary and benefits, and they're doing it in an environment where there so far has been less competition. I mean, the latest jobs data out today suggests that things are starting to kind of open up a little bit. So it'll be interesting to see how that proceeds. But at the moment, it is definitely a workers' economy, just like it's a, kind of a seller's market for housing in many places. So workers are getting to set their terms. The internal mobility is that I mentioned earlier that's so important is also being reflected in something we're seeing in terms of promotion rates. We're seeing a lot higher promotion rates in 2021 than we'd seen in 2020 or even 2019. So again, I think that's a way for employers to start to kind of try to recognize and retain key talent. And then the other theme I wanted to call out here is just this idea that people are now working from anywhere. And so employers are being a lot more flexible. And I know Hayden's touched on this too, is just this idea of like letting people say move to Miami or Jacksonville or Tampa. Florida is very popular. In fact, all the low income tax states have been incredibly popular for people to move to. And where are they moving from? Well, no surprise, a lot of the higher tax and larger city locations. And we saw a lot of outflows during the pandemic. I will just tell you, the latest seems to be that people are now moving back into some of these cities, but it's not the same people that moved away. The people who moved away have left. The people moving back, the people moving in are younger, looking for entry-level jobs, because the big cities are where the entry-level jobs are. They're looking to get away from mom and dad and start fresh in some big city. And so that's who's flowing into the cities. I never count the cities down and out. I don't think I will this time either. But it's definitely the case that probably not moving back. And that's what we're seeing so far. So let me go to the next slide, please, if you will. Fantastic. So we have a lot of observations on remote work. And I always like to say, I think remote is here to stay. It may not be as extreme as it was 6 months ago, where everyone who could work remote was almost 100% remote. But it is definitely a permanent feature of the new way in which we work. We see on our platform that the number of remote jobs has increased significantly. In March 2020, 1 in every 67 jobs on our platform was a remote job. Now it's 1 in 6. We also see that when a remote job is up, it attracts more than 2.5 times the share of job applications as, say, a job that's for an on-site opportunity. So people are attracted to remote work. Women in particular are 24% more likely to apply to a remote role than a non-remote role. So there's something there as well in terms of flexibility that I hope we can unpack. And when we survey members who are working on our platform, 87% of employees prefer to stay remote at least half the time. So they're saying, even though it might be safe to go back, I'm kind of really enjoying this. So nobody misses their commute. Everybody's kind of happy to be at home at least a little bit more than before. So you can see below, there's just a chart showing the attractiveness of remote work, and they get more job views, they get more applications, even though they make up only 16% of, open jobs. And I will add just that now I think over 1/3 of the companies on our platform are offering remote, roles. And of course, there are industries that are much less remote friendly, and there are industries that are much more remote friendly. So it does speak to a disparate experience depending on your skill level and the industry you're in. But that's the general trend that we're seeing. Is like remote is here to stay. It's definitely become normalized. Maybe I'll move on to the next slide, please. Thank you. So I mentioned flexibility earlier, and this idea of like, how do you attract and retain top talent when you are an employer? What's going on? Flexibility is really the key. We've surveyed the members, and when employees are satisfied with their corporate kind of flexibility around the time of day that they work and also the location, they're over 2.5 times more likely to report that they're happy and more likely to stay. We also see that job seekers are pretty choosy. So there's a concept of like the urgent job seeker who's on the site every day applying for jobs and applying will view a job and then apply right away. And then there's the idea of the casual job seeker who might be looking at a job 2 or 3 or 4 times before they decide to apply. They may also not complete the whole interview process and sort of ghost out at some point. And we saw an increase in that ghosting, an increase in the I would say the proportion of job seekers who I would classify as casual as opposed to urgent. There were far more casual job seekers last year. And so we saw that in part because they would view applications more. We also saw time to hire shorten in some cases, suggesting that the job market, of course, is quite tight. And when someone did complete the process, they had a pretty good chance of securing the role. And finally, when we look at like what work-life balance means, it's the most important factor for people, and flexibility is part of that. Of course, comp and benefits always comes out right there as well as essential. And then finally, colleagues and culture. And I would maybe kind of come to this point and close and just say, I think people are looking for opportunities to reconnect at the workplace, both in terms of with their colleagues, so they can kind of just see people and feel the energy, but also there needs to be some sense of culture, like what is this company about? Why am I here? And that will also help retain key talent, is like feeling that sense of purpose. And a lot of this, which I haven't gone into, and I have lots of data on it, has to do with the generational makeup. The fact that by 2030, a third of our workforce in America will be Gen Z. So it'll be millennials and Gen Z that take over the lion's share of the workforce. And they have very different approaches to the companies they choose to work for and why they're working there. And so I think that's also something that employers are trying to shift around to kind of accommodate a very different, but also multi-generational workforce that we're looking towards in the next 8 to 10 years. So with that, I will conclude my part. I'm really looking forward to the rest of the discussion, and I'll turn it over to the next speaker.
Okay, thank you so much, Karen. Lots of great data from both of you there, both you and Hayden. Next up, and I know he's no stranger to data, is my colleague, Nick Bloom. So Nick, take it away.
Great, thanks very much, Mark. Lovely to follow on after Hayden and Karen, who I know them and know their work for some time. You know, I have a weird entry into this. I started working from home back in 2004, and it was a very quiet, you know, backwater topic, I guess. You know, Odesk have been doing this for quite a while, actually. They were very much in the vanguard of this. And then obviously in March 2020, it just exploded. So, you know, I went from spending 5% of my time thinking about this to probably about 80%. And so since March 2020, I've been running multiple surveys. I'll just show you 4 slides of data. And also talking to hundreds of execs, and you know, I talked to Hayden, but all kinds of weird and wonderful stuff. I mean, actually, earlier this week, I talked to an international charity concerned that's actually out in Ukraine. Talked to NASA this week. You know, a lot. So it's not just for profits, but a lot of organizations. So why don't I bring up my 4 slides? And you're going to see they're very consistent, which is great with what Karen and Hayden have been saying. So firstly, just on levels. So where are we? So there's a lot of ways to define working from home. Probably my favorite one single measure is the percentage of full work days from home. So how many complete days we work from home. And this is for US data. Before the pandemic's about 5%. So not many people work days from home before the pandemic, about 1 in 20 days. As you can imagine, it exploded during the pandemic, went up 12-fold to about 60% back in May. And this is data. We've been surveying 5,000 Americans a month since then. And it's gone up and down with various waves. We're now, the latest data we have is for Feb 22 and is down to just a bit over 35%. So it exploded, dropped back. I guess everyone's wondering, you know, where are we heading? So for every month, we ask 5,000 people, not only what they're doing now, but what their employer has told them is going to be their plans post-pandemic. And by now, most people have a pretty good sense. And that's that final dot. And that's at about 25%. So to give you, pre and post, we've gone from 5% to about 25%. So that's a 5-fold permanent increase in work from home during the pandemic. And as both Hayden and Karen said, this is just a permanent, massive structural change. And that's equivalent to something like 30 to 40 years of pre-pandemic growth. So next slide, thanks. So what does this look like? So here's data for the US economy, but it probably represents most organizations. I've been pretty heavily involved in thinking about this in Stanford, and this is certainly accurate for Stanford as an organization. So if you think of Stanford or, the US economy, roughly half of people can't work from home. So they tend to be lower paid. They're mostly non-graduates, not entirely. They're like, frontline retail, manufacturing, essential services, a lot of jobs. So roughly half of, most organizations cannot do this. What about the other half? Well, there's 2 other groups. The middle group is probably everyone listening, is professionals, managers, mostly, not entirely, but mostly graduates, typically higher paid. For folks like that, probably like us, I'm guessing most people listening, they will primarily be hybrid. So pretty dominantly, they're going to be hybrid. So what I mean by that is they're going to spend, say, 3 days in the office, 2 days at home. And a great example would be, say, Apple, Facebook, or a bunch of these companies have all mentioned Microsoft, LinkedIn, that they say, Apple said Monday, Tuesday, Thursday in the office, Wednesday, Friday, work from home. So 3, 2, 2, 3, a lot of different versions of this. Final group is fully work from home. That's about 15%. They are mostly, but not entirely, specialized roles. So there's a mix. This is a pretty disparate group, but a lot of folks in here are IT support, payroll. Often there'll be people working, say, for Odesk contractors that are working out. There are some very, senior folks, for example, in tech like Hayden, a number of Quora Automatic, GitHub. These are fully remote companies, so there's some execs there, but the majority of this group across the entire labor force is going to be folks doing, say, payroll. So they're people that are reasonably quite well paid doing specialized roles, but not normally managing big teams, because that's generally done in a hybrid role. Next slide, thanks. So why is work from home stuck? Well, as you heard from Hayden and Karen, the reason is basically people like it a lot. And in the world's hottest labor markets, Karen mentioned today that the latest data is the US labor market is red hot. You really don't want to do something that upsets your employees. So we've been surveying here, this is data from 17,000 people. This question basically, would you rather work from home hybrid 3 days a week? Are you neutral? Or you'd rather come in 5 days a week? And then we ask people how much they trade this off in terms of salary. The numbers you get is that working from home hybrid for the typical American employee is the same as about an 8% pay increase. So people like it, and you can put a number on it. It turns out that's higher in tech, finance, business services. Why is that? Well, employees in these areas tend to be higher paid. They tend to have nicer houses, better home office, better broadband. So, their jobs lend themselves to work from home. So for anyone listening in, tech, financial services, business services, on average, your employees will probably value this as the same as roughly a 10% pay increase. So not surprisingly, this is very popular, and hybrid work from home has become the dominant model. Like when I talk to hundreds of firms by now, it's the huge share, 95% of them are going to this. Next slide, thanks. I should end by just making a point that, again, Karen made towards the end, and Hayden also mentioned early on, which is there is a big spread in what people want. So I have this question. This one we've run to 55,000 Americans. How often would you like to have paid work days at home post-COVID? Pretty easy question. And in fact, this morning I looked at data right across Europe and into Asia, and you get very similar numbers across countries. I mean, you can hear I'm a Brit. I have pretty good British data on this. It looks very, very similar. So roughly a quarter of people basically don't want to work from home ever again. They're like, I don't like it. It's isolating. It's depressing. They tend to be young singles or older empty nesters. They want to come in 5 days of the week. A bit over a quarter, so 32% here, have the exact opposite view. They really like working from home. They tend to be more middle-aged with young kids in a house, maybe a long commute. And they're like, let me do this forever. And then the remaining roughly a half of people is somewhere in between. So, as Karen said, there's a lot of people that are like, I want to be in the office 2-3 days a week. I mean, that would be me. I like my colleagues. I like seeing my colleagues, but I quite enjoy having, a couple of days of quiet time to work from home. So this makes it hard. And just to point out, for anyone managing large companies, based on this, you can see that whatever policy you pick, you're going to have people at either end that aren't unhappy. This is really hard to deal with. Most in economics, I'm used to seeing, bell curve distributions of, most people like something in the middle and there's some extremes. This is a dumbbell shaped distribution. There's masses at the end, not many in the middle, and it's very hard to deal with. Next slide, thanks. So I'll stop, but just to point out on the left, I have a website, wfhresearch.com, with various co-authors. We just put up a lot of data. Okay, thanks. Let's head to Q&A. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Nick. And again, to Hayden and Karen for those insights and all of that data. And as someone who runs an admittedly small organization, I can just say that it's been, I don't even know, challenging doesn't quite capture how it's been for me. And so I really feel for people running bigger and more complicated organizations, how they're doing it. So with that, I think let me start with some questions. And I want to encourage everyone who's watching to feel free to share your questions too. I'm going to send some questions for our panelists here. And maybe I'll start off with asking either Hayden or Karen, but Nick, you should feel free to weigh in too. What companies should be anticipating and doing in the future as it pertains to hybrid teams, remote work, and so forth? And I know it's not a one size fits all, but in any case, maybe Karen, you can take a stab at this.
Sure. I think one of the things that we're seeing, and I mentioned this earlier, is this remote work is driving this desire for connection and community and purpose. And we're seeing it actually as young people. Nick, we're seeing the same thing. Young people want to come back to the office. They don't want to sit in their tiny little apartment with 4 roommates and 1 shared bathroom and try to work from home. It's no fun. So they want to come in, but they actually don't know how to connect anymore at work. And I'm not criticizing them, but they don't get a chance to have that modeled behavior. So what interesting thing we're seeing is more and more people actually searching on LinkedIn for things like mentorship and effective remote onboarding. So these are huge factors to think about. So what I want to just stress here in my answer quickly is just this idea that maybe there's something to this idea of how do you, when you bring people back in on hybrid, remember that there are certain people who haven't had a lot of opportunity for modeled behavior, how to interact, how to network, how to run meetings. And so they're looking for mentorship. And we saw the searches for mentees and mentors on LinkedIn double compared to a year ago, just in the past couple of months. As people are going back to the office, they're looking for like a little help, a little guidance. So I'll just throw that out as an idea.
So Nick, what are your thoughts on that?
Great. I mean, the other thing that it feels, I'm totally aligned with Karen. In fact, building on this, the big battleground, when you talk to firms, what everyone's decided has become basically the dominant strain is hybrid. So not entirely, there are some firms, I mean, Upwork's doing extremely well, they're fully remote, but there are some tech firms that are fully remote, but most big corporates outside tech are hybrid. The big question I get faced all the time is this battle between choice versus coordination. So if you're going to operate at 3-2, do you either let everyone choose their own days, or do you say you're going to come in on the same 3 days? And I think we're heading eventually towards coordination through a painful process. And the reason, coming back to exactly what Karen says, is when you talk to people that have returned to the office, so a bunch of places did in the fall before Omicron hit, they said if you go in and like only half the people are there and the other half are at home, it's like low energy, you're there shouting into laptops, it's not social. People say like, why am I coming in to like chat into a laptop all day? So I think what's going to happen either at the team level or at the company level, there's going to be a move to coordinate and say, look, during the pandemic, they actually didn't want you coming in on the same day to keep density down. But we're now post-pandemic, people want connectivity, as Karen said, they want mentoring. And so like take Lazard's, I've been talking to the big investment bank. They deliberately said, you're going to come in Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. You're going to work from home Monday, Friday. But that's a battle. I mean, that is a war that is waging, and you talk to people all the time, and it's very contentious.
Yeah, it's tricky. It's definitely not, as you were saying, I hadn't heard that phrase before, the dumbbell distribution, but it is there's a lot of variation across people here. So I'm going to ask a set of questions that are more organization level and others that are more worker level. And I have this one, maybe Karen can start with this one. Is it from where you sit, do you feel like certain sectors have especially benefited or lost from the sort of work from home and hybrid work that we've seen these last 2 years?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we definitely seen there were work from home friendly sectors beforehand. A lot of like what I would call professional and business services sectors. If you were, and Nikki, you already spoke to this a little bit, like a payroll service or something, it was kind of flexible there, or some accounting services, things like that. Definitely technology was it was early on to embrace this sort of work from home. And some of the professional business services, I would say finance was an interesting case. I'm an ex-finance person, so just watching how they sort of kind of, are, I guess, wobbling between the old, like, put your jacket on the back of the chair, let's make sure you're in before the boss, which was definitely there when I was there a few years back, is still, kind of pervasive in the culture. And yet a lot of young people are rebelling against that and not feeling that's as compelling for them. So I think finance is one where they've been able to switch to work from home, but I don't know if it's really embedded itself in the culture. We're definitely seeing things like media media and communications, another sector that was very much remote friendly. But then there are apart from IT, apart from corporate services and media, all of which, I would call remote friendly, there were a lot of industries that weren't. So I don't even think this is an obvious answer, but I do think this is an obvious answer. Retail, of course, struggle with that, leisure and hospitality, because just innately you couldn't provide everybody an opportunity to work from home. Again, also travel, that was one that was slow to pick up on remote jobs, manufacturing, construction, obvious. So what's happening though, is that when you look at where, I'm just give you a sector answer, but the jobs are really growing fastest in those remote friendly areas. And that's where all the eyeballs are going on our platform, are for any kind of remote job. And so increasingly other sectors are starting to kind of find ways to carve out that, I'll call it flexibility, that hybrid option. And I think I would love to actually ask Nick this question, and I'm sorry I'm hijacking Mark, but this idea of like, there's a hybrid idea of like, I'm going to commute back and forth between my office a couple of days a week. And then there's the idea of I'm going to hire someone who I think is an amazing talent, but he or she lives in Atlanta because I want to pull from a more diverse pool of talent. And so I see a lot of tech companies that are casting this much wider net location wide and saying, I don't have a hub in Atlanta, I don't have a hub in Chicago, but I really want to find more diverse, say, Latino talent or diverse Black talent. And I'm not going to find it in Seattle or Palo Alto. So where do I go? And Nick, I just know I may be unfairly asking you, but what do you think about this idea of hiring people who are just permanently in a different location?
No, absolutely. So, I spoke to, for example, Adam D'Angelo, who's the CEO of Quora, and in fact, Hayden, and spoke to Matt Mullenweg in Upwork. And that's definitely one of the big upsides of being fully remote is, of course, you can hire people. My sense is for companies, you kind of want at the team level, either to have the team hybrid or the team fully remote. Because the reason it's hard to manage. Imagine you have 8 people in a team and 2 are fully remote and 4 in person. So my math's terrible. For an economist, that's a huge embarrassment. 2 are fully remote and 6 are in person. Then you have this issue that the 2 that are fully remote are going to suffer from presenteeism bias, and there's masses of evidence of it. And so that's pretty horrible if you think that's also correlated with demographics. So I think it works great, but you're going to have this team is fully remote, this team is hybrid. The other thing, Karen, that's fascinating watching the media and talking to companies is the problems in banking. So if you remember right, David Solomon at Goldman Sachs, particularly in JP Morgan, made a strong stance last spring, so this is spring 2021, kind of chest beating and say, everyone's going to come back full time. We're not messing about here. You're going to come back. Interesting enough, Morgan Stanley, Merrill Lynch, Citibank, Deutsche, Lazards didn't. And they said, oh, no, we're okay with 3-2, basically. We're going to put up with it or encourage it. And what's happened, I know from talking to insiders, is basically Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan effectively backpedaled because the labor market is so hot that they were basically facing a massive flight to the door. And in fact, I've spoken to a few people in these organizations and they haggled deals. They just said, they told their bosses, I'm quitting. I'm going to Merrill Lynch, Morgan Stanley, unless you let me work from home 2 days a week. And Goldman's, rather than lose a third of its employees, they put up pay, actually, partly as kind of danger pay, but also of apparently, so they've yet to get people back. So it's not clear they'll ever get them back. I think that statement is never going to come to pass. I just don't think they're ever going to get there. I get traders, you got to use the fast computers and maybe there's confidential data. For most people that do not, there's not a strong reason to be in 5 days a week, they probably will never fully return even in Goldman Sachs. But we'll see. I'm kind of intrigued to see how this plays out because I know from talking to Goldman insiders, there's a fight going on right now.
Interesting. I was intrigued too. I'm seeing it in the data, but I didn't know the inside story.
Wow, thanks so much to you both. So I want to pivot a little bit, and we've got some great questions coming in from the audience that I'm going to turn to in a minute, but I want to ask a question, maybe start with Nick, and Karen, you should feel free to weigh in too on this. So I've talked with some people, and Nick, you've surely talked with others who are thinking about, given this new world that we're inhabiting, maybe they should change their office space. And basically that's a big line item expense for companies renting, let's say, space for their offices. And so what do you think do you think this is going to be a big change and companies are going to be renting less space in not just for a year, but for a longer time? And what does that mean for the future of, let's say, city centers, very urban areas that are used to bustling and so forth? So thoughts on that, Nick? Why don't you start with that?
Sure. So I'd say this is frankly really surprising to me. So back in June 2020, I thought skyscrapers were dead. City centers are in trouble. It turns out we've surveyed 500 firms in the US, 3,000 in the UK. Net demand for office space is down about -1 or 2%, which is like nothing because you think we're dropping footfall by 30%. So like, how can this be? This seems totally odd. How come there's way less people and they're not shrinking offices? And the reason basically comes back to scheduling. That, as Karen and I were talking earlier, if you have people working hybrid, most companies are either saying, look, you're going to come in on the same day, so you can't save space, or if they're saying they're letting people choose, overwhelmingly people want to work from home on Monday and Friday. So you have the same problem. So it turns out the only way you can really cut space aggressively is do what we do, Mark, with like teaching rooms. is you say, you, Nick, you got to teach Monday, Wednesday morning. Mark, you got to do Monday, Wednesday afternoon, etc., to space out. And that is like really unpopular employees. I mean, no one really wants to be told which days, and particularly told they have to come into the office on Monday, Friday. So the data is, it's soft, but it's not that. I mean, I'd be interested I'm going to stop now and pass over to Karen what she's heard.
I have to tell you, this is a little bit beyond my area. Nick, you're the expert in this idea of office space. What we are seeing, I'll give you two little tidbits, more like popcorn than true insights, or a true meal, is one of the fastest growing jobs, albeit from a low level, on our platform last year, were those folks that could reconfigure our office space. They suddenly became in hot demand in terms of job postings. It was one of the fastest growing job postings, was for not just architects, but also kind of like space planners for office space. Two is just anecdotally hearing from our customers, who are lots of large corporations. They are definitely all kind of trying to lock arms and look across and say what everyone else is doing. And I think they worked out that they need to make their office space a lot more fun, a lot more engaging. So there's been a lot of retooling to be like, oh, we're going to have a place that you want to come into. It's not going to look like it did before, where you come in, it's got beige walls, you have your little cubicle, it's open air, but you have a half wall up to your brow, and you're going to kind of work sort of in isolation, occasionally try to grab a meeting room. They're trying to make it fun, inviting, and then you're coming in, you're doing something intentional. I am collaborating, I am brainstorming, we are having a team meeting or an offsite, so that you're coming in for a reason. You're not just coming in to do work that you could do elsewhere. So I don't have a great answer, but I just want to share with you that what we're seeing is a lot of intentional effort to retool the reason people are going to come in, and recognize people want to come in for a reason and not just to kind of do work they could do from home.
That's a great point. I, as a professor, I forgot, I was going to say 2 points. I just forgot the second, but it's totally aligned. They're not shrinking, but we see lots of data that people are getting rid of individual exec offices, because when you come in, you're supposed to be social. They're not getting rid of all of them, but they're reducing the number and having like more meeting rooms, a bit more open plan space, flexible, and Zoom cubicles for like, if someone's going to have a Zoom call, put them in somewhere that's soundproofed and small.
Exactly. It's a tiny little closet, or the cloffice, as we were joking, the closet office, the cloffice.
Well, thanks to you both for that. And I can just say that here at CEPR, we have like dusted off the ping pong tables and so forth to try to get to the point, Karen, that you were making. So anyway, but okay, so I have tons more questions, but I'm going to ask one more, and then I'm going to draw from audience questions, of which there are many great ones. But please feel free to keep sending them in. And this is kind of a multiple part question. So, what is the effect of work from home on employee productivity and the sort of time that they're spending working because they're not commuting? And then should managers adjust expectations, since their ability to monitor is now very different than in the past? And I don't know, either of you can start. Nick, I guess, why don't you go ahead first?
Okay, I'll go quickly. I would say in summary, the evidence is hybrid, which is like 3-2. Is probably net positive, small positive. Actually, I'm running a big randomized control trial right now, whereby we have 1,600 engineers in a tech firm, actually, of which 800 of them are in the office, 800 of them are hybrid, and it was randomized, but even on our birthdays, we see that hybrid folks are slightly more productive. We've seen this in lots of other data. The main reason, as you find out, is primarily save a lot of time on commuting. So the average American saves 60 minutes a day on commute, and spends 20 rather than 30 minutes getting ready for work, or they work from home. So you're saving 70 minutes a day, of which around 40%, which is 30 minutes, goes to the employer. So if you have employees and you let them work from home for 2 days a week, they work about 1 hour more a week for you, and that boosts productivity. And also, if it's well organized, as Karen and I were talking about earlier, quiet stuff you do at home, and quiet stuff is better done in a quiet place. So I would actually say this is what hybrid is so dominant. It's like a win-win. Employees like it, and it seems to increase productivity. And I'll stop and hand to Karen.
Karen, yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I don't actually measure productivity from our data. That's why I gestured to Nick. He should go first. He's the expert here. But what I will say is that what we see is that when we survey people just about how they feel, and what are you doing when you're not, what are you doing when you're not, using this time for commuting? it is a whole range of everything from childcare and orthodontist appointments to I'm working out, I'm sleeping. You know, I save that hour of commute every day fighting on the highway, especially if you're in California, but anywhere, you know, New Jersey. I'm now sleeping in a little bit more, or I exercise, or, you know, I'm just preparing food. So a lot of people are really using that time. I know that's not exactly the point of productivity, but a lot of them are using the time for themselves. And I think that's partly why remote has become so popular for many people. I do think, and I'll just come back and hammer the point one last time, is I do think that it's really different depending on your age. And I think both Hayden and Nika already made this point too, but what Gen Z is looking for is really different than what the Gen X is looking for, or even the boomers. And we had some really interesting data just showing that everyone's reacting very differently to this shift in the workplace. And a lot of the boomers in our data are literally just kind of, I want to say, still sheltering in place and like running down the clock. They're like, all right, I'm gonna pick my retirement date. I've picked it. I'm gonna stay. I'm not gonna change jobs the way millennials and Gen X and Gen Z are. I'm not job hopping. Not much is gonna lure me. I'm not interested in learning online as much. And it's partly generational, but I think it's also just, it's been such a shock. And there's been so much stress to them in terms of like, do I feel safe? That they have really sort of, their behavior is just really different on our platform than all the other generations.
Great, thanks to you both. And I'm going to start drawing from, we've got many more questions than I can possibly ask, so I'm just going to hit some, and I apologize to attendees if I don't get to your question, but there's more great ones than I can ask. So a question for both of you: is the workforce going to become more global given work from home trends? And if so, how might that affect U.S. Domestic labor market opportunities? And maybe Karen, do you want to start with that?
We think that might be where things are going. So we are able to, at LinkedIn, we're able to see where people are signing on from, right? So I can tell if did you used to sign on from San Francisco and now you're in Austin, Texas? Okay, that's the usual story. We all know a lot of tech workers moving out of expensive California real estate for something cheaper, more space, blah, blah, blah. But we can also see people who were LinkedIn members in India, and then they became LinkedIn members in New York or in Seattle. And that, of course, decreased. That standard flow of LinkedIn members who were coming to the US, say, or from China, really, of course, abruptly stopped during the pandemic. It is starting to repair itself, but for a whole host of reasons related to visa policies and immigration policies, it hasn't fully repaired. And so I think what's interesting is when a company's looking for the best possible talent, if they already have a legal hub for people to work from in that country, they are open to saying maybe this role could be done in Mexico as opposed to Canada. Maybe this role could be done in Bangalore as opposed to Boston. And that is, I think, a conversation people are starting to have, but they haven't yet fully committed to. So what I'm seeing is people entertaining the idea, but not yet doing it in conversations with executives. But they're definitely thinking about maybe the talent place is a global talent place. And this is probably more compelling, I would say, for continental Europe, that has a lot more of a harmonized set of policies and movement of labor capital and human capital. It's probably less so for the US, which has to sort of navigate a whole bunch of tax treaty issues to kind of say hire someone in a different country. But for European conglomerates, it's become much more of a possibility.
Super interesting. Okay, thanks. And Nick, your thoughts on this?
I'm going to go on to the next one. I'm completely aligned with Karen, so I'm happy to take the next question.
Okay, great. Okay, so moving forward, would you both say that companies who are trying to return to pre-pandemic work practices, 40 hours a day, 5 days a week in the office, can they be competitive and successful in the marketplace? I mean, I recognize some jobs you have to be in person. For example, if you're a nurse, you got to be there and that kind of thing. But for a lot of jobs, can you compete?
So happy to take a first cut. I think of those three things, 5 days a week, 40 hours a day, that's fine. But as in the workplace, the location, the time, it's not. People I think are not, haven't suddenly got a preference to work less hours. They always wanted to work less, and it's if you pay them. But that in the 5 days a week being in the office, I think is a huge issue. So to give you just another chart, I'm kind of explaining it, but we asked people this question: if your employer told you you had to return to your office 5 days a week post-pandemic, what would you do? We gave them 3 options, of which return to the office was one. I think 53% of people said that. The second was return to the office, but actively look for a work from home or hybrid job. And about 30% of people said that. And the third was quit on the spot. And that was about 10%. So you can see that if you try and do a Goldman Sachs, which is why basically even a Goldman Sachs hasn't done a Goldman Sachs, of getting people back in 5 days a week, you risk facing about a 40% attrition rate. And actually, to make it worse, as I think it was either Karen or Hayden mentioned earlier, it's not random in terms of preferences to work from home. For example, minorities have a higher preference. Women have a slightly higher preference. People with young kids definitely do. Disabled people do. So you not only lose a vast flood of your labor force, you're also going to have an issue of diversity. So I think it's such a killer idea that I just don't hear this from big firms anymore. It's kind of, it's like telling your employees they're going to work 7 days a week. Of course you can do it, but you're going to lose most of them. So I know I'll be interested in what Karen, but I just don't come across it,
Yeah. Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. I was agreeing with you. I absolutely see so it was me, I think, who said that, because we do see that women prefer remote. And, one of the things that we also see is that when you ask women, like, what kind of flexibility do you want? They want flexibility both, especially with time. I mean, location, yes, but especially with time. They want to be able to say, like, I'm not going to be available in the afternoon from 2 to 4 on Wednesdays because I have, a commitment. It could be elder care, child care, whatever. So they want some more flexibility in time. So I think it's entirely possible to say, look, we'd like people to work 5 days a week if we pay you commensurate for that. But they want some flexibility, autonomy, and respect. And so here's a great example. I was talking to a large corporation that has basically a lot of their employees are, may not have a college degree. They might be working salary or hourly, and they basically work out of a break room. And the idea of giving them control over their schedule, giving them notice, like, hey, here's your schedule for the next, quarter, as opposed to just saying, here it is for next week, and I'm going to tell you today what it is for next week. You have no ability to plan for a doctor's appointment or emergency child pickup or anything. And they also no longer do it with a piece of paper posted on the wall, which makes it feel very fixed, inflexible. How do you change that piece of paper? Now it's an app. You can check it. It's dynamic. I can switch with someone. Hey, I can't do Wednesday. Can you take my Wednesday? And you give a little bit more empowerment to that worker and a little more dignity in terms of being able to control their schedule. And that's huge. A lot of people, what they really want is some dignity and autonomy. And of course, I may not be talking only about white collar workers. I'm talking about what we might call, blue collar workers, or workers who traditionally may not be as digitally skilled. These workers also are looking for flexibility, and it's hugely important. And there's lots of little ways you can do it, even by just sort of making that break room schedule be something that's technologically flexible. You can go in and change yourself or swap. So I just want to give you that example.
So one question that we have a little bit, and Karen, I'll start with you on this, is just like how this, we're basically 2 years out now from when, not quite, from when the pandemic hit. And obviously the pandemic has had some hugely negative, just massively negative health effects and many other mental health effects, all sorts of things. But now there's been just a gigantic disruption to the labor market, where people are working and so forth. So how would you sort of assess just kind of employee morale? We've got 150 million people working in the US, ballpark. And, obviously, once again, it's not everybody's happy, everybody's sad, but do you feel optimistic about, as we settle into this new equilibrium where people are working, doing a little more hybrid stuff, about how people's fulfillment from their work is going to change?
I think because it's a workers' market right now, it's a really exciting moment. My guess is we don't often get these. I'm looking to see how long this lasts. And Nick, please, I'd love when it's your chance to jump in and play. I'd love to hear your views on this. My guess is that this is going to last at least through this year. But I think that it's super exciting. I'm actually optimistic about it. I think the labor market's incredibly strong. I think that the younger generation that's making up, as I said, an increasing proportion of the workforce. By the way, Gen Zs right now are only about 25 years old. So there's a whole tail of them who are coming on, and they are not lazy or any of these tropes. They're excited and empowered. They actually go on LinkedIn and do way more self-taught learning online with classes than any other generation. So they are embracing their career path in a way that you don't often see in other generations. And I want to give them credit for that, because I think it's going to make it really dynamic. And I think no matter where the labor market goes in the future, what you have is a workforce that is expecting to be learning throughout their career, that is willing to go online and like pick up new skills, or at least give it a go. And is willing to say like, hey, I think you ought to like evaluate me as a candidate based on my skills and not just based on where I went to school, or who I know. Although those, of course, are huge determinants of our outcomes, unfortunately, which make it very vastly unfair. But I think this generation is much more open to saying, I also want a workforce that I work with that's diverse, that looks like me or like my neighborhood or my family. And they're not going to be content to work for a place that doesn't feel dynamic, tech forward, multi-generational, multi-ethnic, multiracial. So I'm actually super excited. I hope I'm right in the long run, but I think only time will tell.
Wonderful.
Yeah,
thanks, Karen. And yeah, Hayden, do you want to chime in
on that, Karen? And apologies, I had to step away. But I don't know if this has been addressed in the last few minutes, but I think there's also such an important difference between what the mood was and what people's experience was during the pandemic with remote work and all of the conditions that came with working remotely during the pandemic versus what the experience can be as we come back into the next chapter of work, leveraging the tools and technologies that so many companies adopted as they were grappling with all of the realities of the last 2 years, with now realizing that they figured out they can make remote work part of their workforce and now can intentionally design work practices, the hybrid part, the on-site part, to really speak to what the next chapter of work can look like. And I think, the pessimists say like, oh, like the last 2 years were terrible. How can we move forward into this? It looks, like it's going to be a disaster. But the optimist, which I am an optimist on this, says, look at everything we've learned. Now we can take all of the lessons of what didn't work and what did work. And frankly, the realization that we're capable of so much change as workers and as businesses, and put that to work to design better workplaces and work practices that work best for both our team members and for our businesses. And I do think there is such a huge win-win here for everyone. And if we lean into that, we can come out way ahead. And while the practices won't look like what they looked like during the pandemic, everyone can benefit from this. And so I think the morale hit that people felt during the pandemic doesn't need to be what the next chapter of work looks like. And I totally agree with what Karen was saying about the energy of newer generations of workers in the workforce. We also see this on the freelance side of the house, where, freelancers are the ones the most advanced at doing things like upskilling, self-skilling in terms of, all of that side of things. Also, we see things like, people constructing these careers in really different, vibrant ways, where it's not about a one-track model where I'm just freelancing or I'm just working inside of a company. People are constructing their careers to be very different, where they're doing a side hustle, they're working full-time, they're doing, business, building a business. The work tapestry of today looks very different. And I think that is also a really exciting new trend that is part of the fixture of what the new work model looks like, that workers can lean into and that businesses also need to get comfortable with, that they're not kind of owning the employee the way they did in the past, but participating in the workers' kind of work ecosystem in a different way. So these are very exciting different things. But again, I think we have to get comfortable that the future doesn't look like the past, but it can be, a very positive thing.
Great. Thanks so much, Hayden. And Nick, is there anything you want to add before we close?
Hayden and Karen did it perfectly. I'll leave it to the experts. Thanks.
Okay, wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Nick, Karen, and Hayden. That was a really great conversation, and I'm so grateful that you were able to join us, as I know all three of you are super busy. I hope that our CPRA associates will be joining us in just a few minutes during an exclusive session that will continue this conversation. Nick is going to be there, as will Hayden and Karen. And for everyone, I hope that you'll be able to join us at noon Pacific for our keynote session with Janet Yellen, the only person in human history who has been the chair of the Council of Economic Advisors, the chair of the Federal Reserve, and the Secretary of the Treasury. So I think we're in, I think it's going to be a great session. But for now, I look forward to seeing many of you, hopefully in just a couple minutes, and the rest in about a half hour. And thank you again so much to our wonderful panelists.